when folks tell me like, I can't get budget, I can't get buy-in, my program is underappreciated, underfunded, not understood. A lot of the time that's because you're not telling the right story, right? The board is not the place to go ask for stuff, and they're not who actually, they may sign off on your budget, but if you go in there hat in hand asking for money, that's a terrible thing to do. Don't do that. Where you ask for money and get stuff and go hat in hand is to executive, probably a steering committee, something like that. That's where you tell that threat story. That's where you tell that exposure story. That's where you ask for the bag of money.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Security Repo Podcast. We have a fantastic show for you today because we're looking at the business side of cybersecurity. Business leadership and security leadership in an organization don't often meet eye to eye, which is why this episode is really fascinating. We team up with Walt Powell, who is a cybersecurity thought leader that specializes in providing executive guidance around risk, governance, compliance, and IT security strategies. He spent his career helping organizations build strong teams and programs that can securely enable companies' business goals. Now, as a former CISO and now a field CISO for organizations, we'll dive into exactly what is a field CISO if you're not sure, like I wasn't. We go on a journey with Walt to discover what it actually takes to move into security leadership, how you can work with organizations' business goals to get your security plans enabled, and how to move into security leadership. Now, Walt also tells us exactly what skills you need to develop to get into security leadership. So if you're looking to one day become a CISO, or you want to better understand the business side of an organization and how it relates to cybersecurity, then this episode is absolutely for you. So without further ado, let's dive into today's episode with Walt Powell. I was just going to jump off here because I see the first question. Well, I didn't get the privilege of meeting you in person, but Dwayne does and had great things to say. But your title is Field CISO. So I wanted to know what is a Field CISO and how is this kind of like different to what we would associate as, that let's call it the normal regular CISO.
Field CISO is just a CISO. I like to call it recovering CISO. It's a guy who got tired of having responsibilities and being woken up at night and decided that it would be easier to go mentor and peer and talk to other CISOs about how to CISO instead of having to do it himself. So I work for CDW now instead of out in the field, and I've actually made that jump back and forth on the other side of the table a couple of times, from kind of practitioner to seller, kind of back and forth a few times. And so instead of having to do it myself and own the responsibility, myself and my team of recovering CISOs now consult with folks. We exist in a pre-sales capacity, but we're not really part of the sales team. We're really more like free consultants, really. We do a lot of kind of risk consulting, and we help folks understand how to build programs, or not so much tool selection stuff that like normal pre-sales would do, but kind of up a tier from there, right? Like not what do you buy, but more like how do we choose what to do next kind of discussions, right?
Right. You're empowering the other people to be able to make those decisions, I guess, like going through the process of, I'm not going to pick it, but here's a high level of what you need to look at, I guess, and what to consider that perhaps wouldn't be so obvious. Is that fair, or have I gone left field?
That's exactly it. And a lot of the time folks will come and say, hey, we're trying to pick between solution A and solution B. And a lot of the time our job is to say, hey, have you considered approach A and approach B? And they'll be like, oh, we've never even thought of approach B, right? And a lot of the time when you're talking to like a solution architect, they also haven't thought of approach B, right? Or have you thought about the broader how that plugs into your business problem, or how you're going to go get budget for that, or why you're going to do that all together, or how you're going to decrement that, or the kind of things that you have to have sat in that seat to have thought about, right? And a lot of the time when you're having seller conversations, the sellers haven't felt that pain and don't know how to have that conversation, right?
Understandable. What the CISO should be bringing is that business perspective. That's the C I always thought of in CISO. Like that's why there's a C level.
Right.
um, that larger view. And that's actually one of the main reasons I was excited to invite you on to the podcast. Is I saw your talk back at CypherCon 6, I believe, up in Milwaukee. Your why your board deck sucks, which was just the most compelling talk name I think of the entire event. And I just had to go see what are you talking about? Like where did that come from? I mean, could you give us just a quick super high level on like why do people make bad board of director decks?
Sure. So it comes up kind of a lot. And as we're out there talking to CISOs, it just came up over and over and over. And it kind of started a little bit tongue in cheek. And I had this collection of, like, honestly, like pretty bad examples of things people had put in front of their board, like honest to goodness real life deck examples. And I was like, hey, I should share these and kind of give folks like what you might do instead, right? So we'll clean them up and protect the names to change the names to protect the innocent, right? And that's where it started. Was we'll share some of these examples, um, things like folks sharing operational metrics with their board and telling the wrong story, and there's a lot of uh, not understanding the role of the board. And so when folks tell me like I can't get budget, I can't get buy-in, the my program is underappreciated, underfunded, not understood. A lot of the time, that's because you're not telling the right story, right? Um, and a lot of that can be very quickly fixed by tweaking the story that you're telling, and cleaning up those metrics. A lot of the time, when folks are talking about the KRIs that they're showing, they're actually showing KPIs, and so there's some real quick fixes and things that we can do. And that's where that all kind of started from, was, hey, what if we uh, took some of these lessons learned and shared them with folks, and talked about some of that kind of language of business stuff. Also, I get the question a lot, and you hear and a lot of the guidance, right? You'll hear this all the time as you read the CISO books or you see the CISO webinars. People will say to you the same things over and over. You need to align to the business, you need to speak the language of business and those kind of things. But nobody ever tells you how to do that. They just tell you to do it. And nobody gives you the guidance, like, how do you do that, right? And then when you ask them, how do you do that? People clam up pretty quick. Like, they give you some platitudes and that's it. And so we wanted to figure out, like, how do I give you some real world, like, actionable ways to actually do that, as opposed to just saying, go figure out how to do it, right?
Real quick, you used a couple acronyms in there, and just so everybody listening is on the same page, you said KRI versus KPI.
Sure.
Could you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Sure. So KPI is a key performance indicator, and a KRI is a key risk indicator. And so a key performance indicator would be operational metrics, the things that your program does, right? So how many emails did we block? What's the mean time to detection? How many tickets did we close? All that information about what did my program do, right? KRIs are key risk indicators, and that should be information that should be about how did we move the risk. And the easiest way to convert a KPI into a KRI is by first just like creating a target, a baseline, like what percent toward our target did we hit, right? And a lot of the time people confuse those ideas. And I gave an example in that talk, that your board deck sucks talk, that was a real world example where we had a client come to us and they had taken a pass at updating their KPIs, and they had these metrics where they had disclosed a bunch of sensitive data in email. And so they had these metrics about how many hundreds of thousands of emails with sensitive data had gone out. And they were sharing this information about we sent out hundreds of thousands of emails that contained a bunch of sensitive data. And they were sharing that up into executives in the board. And then they tweaked those to make them more granular and show now we're blocking, I don't know, tens of thousands of these hundreds of thousands of emails. And it showed an improvement, but it wasn't telling the story that they thought they were telling. It was still a performance metric. And if I'm sitting in that seat, it still honestly seemed scary. You were still sending out tens of thousands of pieces of sensitive data, and it wasn't telling the story that they thought they were telling. It didn't really explain the effect that they were having or what the impact was to the business. They'd made a pass at fixing it, but what they didn't do was set that target, explain what they'd done against the target, and what they definitely hadn't done was quantify that in any way. So when we came in to help them fix it, there were some very easy things we could do. The first thing was set a goal, right? Like, hey, what you really did was reduce this by 40%. Like you made a 40% reduction in the first quarter. Now you have a story, right? Hey, in one quarter, we reduced this by 40%. Here's our target. Here's what we're trying to get to. You can also now tie actual dollars and cents numbers to this. Take the basic breach number, whatever it is, $4 per record, $6 per record, whatever it is that Ponemon Institute or whoever says is the cost per breach record, tie that to a breach record, and you can start to say, we had an exposure of number of incidents by that dollar amount, $9 million exposure. We reduced that by 40%. We just saved you $3 million or whatever. That's a compelling story. That's how you can turn a KPI into a KRI and tell a story to a board member or to an executive that means something. You spent X dollars, you saved $3 million in risk exposure. The lights came on. It was a very easy tweak in a set of numbers you were already showing that went from some wonky thing that puts people to sleep to a business story that makes people go, oh, we understand what we're investing in. We understand how you invested our money and gave us a return on investment. Thank you very much.
It's always amazing how core storytelling is the farther up you go in an organization. Like,
absolutely.
Just getting your job done is hard enough, but convincing other people of a bigger idea, that takes a special talent, I think, and one that can definitely be honed and one you can adopt, but definitely there's a skill there. So maybe talent's the wrong word, but skill to that. So always appreciate people talking about storytelling.
I was just going to say there that I really hope that people listening really capture in on that, because all the technical ability in the world is really important in an organization, but it doesn't necessarily get you to the top, because you have to be able to convey what's actually happening. That's how you get the budget. That's how you implement the tools. That's how you can build a successful program, and that's ultimately how you become secure. And I think a lot of people in security really focus on technical ability, which again is really important, but you have to convey that to someone that isn't technical. And I think that's a part that's really missing. And just hearing you talk about some of the little things that you can do, it's like, this is a manageable, learnable skill. Like, you don't have to be the most charismatic person in the world. You just need to be able to present the correct information in the right way to the right people.
100%. So half of the Your Board Deck Sucks deck is about storytelling. It literally is just about storytelling. Like, the same storytelling information that you would get if you went to like a short story writing class, right? Like, literally start at the end, figure out what the key information is, make sure you're getting your key points across, get those key points to the beginning. There's a wonderful book by a guy named Orland Croft called Pitch Anything, and he talks a lot about controlling people's attention and how to move important information to the beginning of your discussion, because people have very short attention spans and you only will pay attention in very brief amounts. And he talks about it's been a little bit debunked at this point, the idea that you have like a primordial lizard brain and an advanced mammalian brain. But the idea, like, even though that part's kind of debunked, the idea that you have instinctual reactions to things emotionally and then like logical ways that you process stuff is still basically true, right? And even though you wrote your presentation using your logical brain, that is not how people receive it. People receive it using that defensive, like primordial part of their brain, right? And so you have to get past that. They have to like accept you on a social level. They have to accept you on all those. And so his book is great about talking about like how do you move that information up early so that people accept it and aren't defensive to it and can consume it the way that people want and need to consume it fast, because people's attention is super finite and it's one of the most scarce resources, especially for high-end board type folks, right? So there's a bunch of that in the deck. But the story, the other thing that's important about the story that you're telling when you're doing this is being a translator. So I talk about this a lot. When you're a CISO, I feel like one of your biggest jobs is to be like basically a language translator. You're translating the language of security into the language of business, right? And business has four basic languages. They are accounting, finance, economics, and risk. And when we talk about risk, there are two spheres of risk: your IT risk and then business risk, right? And a lot of the time, guys are communicating in their IT risk instead of in business risk. And so business risk is going to be things like uptime and legal, and even when it comes to your stuff, that all boils down basically into like breach reduction, cost reduction, efficiency kind of stuff for the most part, right? So figuring out how to communicate in the terms that the business cares about, those kind of accounting terms and finance terms, and figuring out what are the things that the CFO cares about. What are the CFO's targets? How are you owned? What creates value for your business, right? Are you owned by a PE? Are you owned by venture capital? Are you public? And if you're public, how do you create value? Is it all share price, or do you pay a dividend? Or what is the thing that is value for your company, and what are your financial targets, right? Are you a company that's trying to make major growth? Are you trying to hit an EBIT target? Those are all different levers that you can pull depending on the value that your company is trying to hit. And that is the language that they care about, right? So whether it's revenue targets or whatever, you can align as you start to talk about how do you align your program to the business. Those are the things that you want to be aligning to. So you can go talk to your CFO and say, hey, CFO, what are the things that get you bonused? What are the targets that you care about? What are the measures that the business is trying to hit? What creates value? When does it get created? Who determines that? And then I can use things like CapEx and OpEx to move things like EBIT targets. I can use things like I can create competitive differentiators and stuff using security to move customer value. When boards say they have things like ESG initiatives, like that has security written all over it, and I can start to align to the business that way. and translate my stuff into the business stuff.
One of the other big takeaways I got from right along these lines is that difference between a threat and a risk, and who you're presenting to your board versus your exec team, and like the subtle difference there. Maybe not so subtle to you, but it was one of the big takeaways that I came out of the room thinking, like, I have never thought in those terms before, that they are two different audiences. I'm wondering if you could just elaborate. I think you were already on that path of IT risk versus business risk, but without having to give the entire presentation here for us, you dig into that just a little bit more?
Sure, absolutely. So when you're talking about IT risk and business risk, and when you're talking about risk in general, one of the things that happens a lot when folks are trying to explain risk is they conflate the idea of risk and threat. And so I see a lot of the time when folks have a risk register, or when they're presenting their biggest risks to their board, and they write down like, hey, board, here are our biggest risks, and they'll write down a list, and that list will include things like our biggest risk is ransomware. Our biggest risk is we have unpatched legacy OS machines. Our biggest risk is we have I don't know, things like that. Well, one of those is an exposure, one of those was a threat. Those things aren't risks, right? A risk is something that presents an exposure, something that is an exposure that would cause damage, that would cost you something, right? Whereas the threat is the actor, the mode, the thing that would cause the damage, and the exposure is the vulnerability, the underlying problem, right? So in that scenario, the ransomware is the threat, the insider threat thing is the threat, the crime families, or the nation states are the threat, and all the CVEs and stuff are our exposures. And when we're talking about the risk should be things like, we have risks of downtime, we have risks of legal action, we have risks of, even when we start talking about, we might lose data, we might have unauthorized access, we might have these things. When we start talking about we have unauthorized access, is that really the risk? Well, kind of maybe not. What happens with that unauthorized access? What is the thing that causes the harm? Where's the harm is the actual risk, right? And so when you start trying to figure out what is the risk, and you look at like, how do you decompose risk, and you go to like the CISSP definition, or you go to FAIR and start figuring out how do you decompose it, that equation, right, of what is risk, it's that probability of when's it going to happen times the impact, right? And then when you decompose that, inside of probability is threat. So threat is actually part of risk. It's like a subcomponent. And so when you're sharing threat, you're kind of sharing just like a sub part of risk. And so folks conflate that all the time. And so they're kind of telling the wrong story, especially to the business, and the business doesn't care about threat. I mean, they do. There's nothing wrong with giving a threat brief to your board like once a year or whatever it is, to kind of keep them abreast of what's going on in the world. But the language that they're trying to speak is risk. What they're trying to understand is, what's the exposure? What's the impact to the business? What does this cost us? What are we trying to get ahead of? Like, what am I getting for my money, right? So the messaging to the board is the risk messaging, and it's the risk messaging in the business context and not in the IT context. Where you might tell the threat story, like I said, is maybe once a year to the board to give them that threat briefing. But where you might tell that threat story more frequently is to like an executive team when you're trying to get that budget for the thing you're trying to buy, right? You might include that threat story or that exposure story in the brief that is, I'm trying to buy the solution to solve for X, and it's X versus Y, and here's what I'm solving for. And you might include the brief in there, and that's a different story because a lot of the time you'll hear folks when they give you guidance about going to the board, they'll give you guidance about going to the board and asking for stuff. And that's, I would tell you, don't do that. The board is not the place to go ask for stuff, and they're not who actually, they may sign off on your budget, but if you go in there hat in hand asking for money, that's a terrible thing to do. Don't do that. Where you ask for money and get stuff and go hat in hand is to executive, probably a steering committee, something like that. That's where you tell that threat story. That's where you tell that exposure story. That's where you ask for the bag of money. And that's where you tell that story, right? So I would suggest 90% of the time, you're not going to expose that threat story to board folks. You're going to keep the risk story for the board. Was that did I hit on?
Yeah, absolutely. That was what I was hoping. That was really what I was hoping for. That was the meat of what I took away from that part of your talk. Storytelling is all great, but that little insight is the thing that you can ask Mac. I haven't shut up about when I've been reviewing like talks I saw this year and big insights I've taken away from my time out in the field.
But I want to break up a little bit from some of this content, and I want to ask you a couple of questions that I'm going to ask everyone that comes on the show. In a game I call the best and the worst, and I want to know what was the best and worst piece of advice in security that you've ever received or potentially given. So we'll start with what is the best? What is the best piece of advice that you think that you have been given in your security journey, or given if you prefer?
So best piece of advice I've been given. A while back, a guy named Matt Sharp, who wrote the book CISO Evolution, along with a guy named Rock Lambros. But Matt Sharp, he was doing his MBA, and he told me, he's like, hey, you really need to understand all of this, the stuff that's in an MBA, basically. Like that's what is at the core of the CISO job, and you need to go understand this, and you need to understand how this aligns to the CISO job. And I was like, you're a crazy person. I don't know why. And he got way ahead of me and a lot of my peers. And he was right. So much of what we're talking about here today is that, and is in that CISO Evolution book also. So yeah, Matt was a trailblazer in all of this, like business alignment. I don't know that it's necessary to go get an MBA, but it is necessary to understand business concepts, because that journey from being a technical CISO to being a business CISO, I think is fundamental. It's core, right? And you mentioned it, Dwayne, at the beginning, is putting that the C part in CISO, right? And moving from that kind of 2.0 CISO to a 3.0 CISO. And that was the big one to me. That was what was transformational to like my thinking about how to do this role.
All right. Great advice there. I completely agree with it. But now let's flip the script. And this doesn't necessarily need to be the worst advice that someone's personally given to you, but in general advice that's out there in the, what is something that you hear maybe in presentations or talks that you got to think to myself, that's just not a good, this is not a good way to do it. Do you have one for us?
There's so much of it, and there's so much of it right now. How do I even begin to pick? I hear a lot of craziness. So one of the things that I despise the most right now is like RFP, RFI. So I see a lot of folks do just like blanket solution selection with just like paper RFP, RFI, and this is what they end up doing. So they want to buy a thing. they want to buy a vehicle, right? And I'm just going to use this as an example for a security tool. And so they create an RFP that says it needs to have 4 wheels, and it needs to have paint, and it needs to have a steering wheel, and it needs to have a dashboard, and it needs to have an engine. And they get back because all the vendors then see this and say, oh, I can wedge my thing in here because my thing has all of that. And they get back they get back an answer for an airplane and a bulldozer and a Honda and a Ferrari. And then they're like, oh, which one of these things should I get? And they now have an airplane and a bulldozer and a Honda and a Ferrari, and they could not be more different. And what they needed to do was solve the business problem in the first place, right? And figure out, do I need a bulldozer or do I need a Honda, right? And figure out how do I build a business process around this? How am I going to staff this thing? What am I trying to accomplish with it? But instead, we try and solve this technical problem and RFI it and let all the vendors tell us what to do with it. And we end up with an airplane when we needed a Honda. And then now we have all this shelfware and all this ridiculous sprawl. And then we end up doing these expensive tool rationalizations and the shelfware, and the industry's just rampant with it. And it's a mess, and the whole industry is a mess, and it makes me insane. And I wish we could figure out how to stop doing that. So that one makes me crazy. And then that paired with the talk of like defense in depth, which is antiquated to me. I still hear a lot of that, and when we should be talking in favor of something more like zero trust, but we won't go down that path. But
I can sense that the defensive depth has hurt you. there's some pain in there that wants to come out. Maybe that's another episode. Why defense in depth sucks.
Every time I hear zero trust now, I think of, I forget who said it, but the company asked us for zero risk, and we turned around and gave them zero trust.
Well, and there's your other problem. The company asked for zero risk, and instead of having the you don't really want zero risk conversation, you don't really want zero risk. You probably want a lot of risk. How much risk do you really want? What's realistic? You don't want zero risk in any other part of your business. You want all kinds of risk. That's part of doing business. You take on all kinds of risk. That's the nature of business. Let's figure out what right size risk is for this part of your business. That's the whole thing, right?
So don't want to take your whole day here. I want to start wrapping things up. You told us about the best and worst advice you've heard. So I'm going to give you a chance to give some advice that, maybe you'll get judged on later in life. But for people that are on track or want to be on track to be a CISO or a field CISO, just what general advice would you give that person?
Just don't do it.
And that's all we have for today, guys.
Why would you want to do such a crazy thing? Get out of cybersecurity, get into AI. That's where it is right now. Cybersecurity is getting commoditized. Jump to AI. That's where the money's going to be. If I was going to start off in cybersecurity and try and work my way into the C-suite, the thing is, it's a balancing act, and how do you do both things? And to be a good CISO, you have to be both things, and there aren't enough folks who are good on both ends, right? So you have to understand the technical stuff, and you have to be good at business. And there are so many folks that are one or the other. You get these MBAs who don't understand the security part at all. You get the guy who is like the best architect, best engineer, who has zero view into the business part. And either way, when they end up in that seat, they struggle. Like, how do you get both? And so you got to study both things, right? So if you are that guy who is the best engineer in your company and you want to be the CISO, go start learning those MBA concepts. If you're that MBA who wants to be the CISO, make sure you're going out and getting those CISSP concepts and understanding the attacks and the tools and the things. Either way, it's an uphill slog, but being able to marry the two things really is the magic. And because the job is translator, right? Job is, how do you translate security language into business language? And unless you are fluent in both languages, you're not going to be a good translator. And that really is the whole job.
I love it. I think that will appear in a different episode of the show of Best Advice. I'm certain of it. But I hope so anyway. Well, Dwayne, do you know, we've taken up enough of your time. I guess we could wrap it up. Dwayne, do you want to kick us off for the wrap ups of here? Well, I guess I'm already speaking.
You're already speaking. Yeah, you already kicked us off.
Well, I just want to thank you for coming on here. I want to give the audience something to take away. What's the best place where they could follow you? You're obviously presenting at conferences. How can our audience members keep in touch with you? What's the best place for them to find out about what you're up to and maybe come see one of your presentations in the future?
I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I have all my stuff is on LinkedIn. I have a recurring newsletter on LinkedIn where I publish a series of articles and stuff too. I have the CISO's Guide to series that comes out on LinkedIn also. So pretty much everything you'd want to know about everything that I know is on LinkedIn. I'm moving from Twitter to Threads, I think. We'll see how that pans out, whether or not we can supplant Elon. We'll see if that takes off or not.
We were just talking about Threads before you came onto the show. But look, for all the audience members, there's going to be links in the show notes of where you can follow Walt to his social media. And with that, I just want to say thanks again, Walt, for the great advice. It's been a really informative episode, and I'm sure everyone's going to take a lot from it. Dwayne, any final words?
I just want to say thanks again for taking the time, Walt, and sharing your knowledge with us and the whole community. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. This was great.